of organizing this rally.
Thank you very much for having me. I think it's safe to take off my gloves and take down my hood here for a few minutes. 25 years after Chernobyl, we're witnessing another nuclear tragedy in Japan on the same scale. This time, the Japanese engineers and the other engineers felt that they had learned from Chernobyl and other accidents, and they everything that they could do, they did to try to prevent. They thought about the risks of earthquakes. They considered the possibilities of tsunamis and protected against. They planned for electricity blackouts. The Japanese people thought they were safe, and then the impossible happened. In spite of all of this, in the United States, the nuclear industry, the Obama administration, and others, including our own Senator Mark Udall, are pushing hard to try to build new nuclear power plants in this country and to put forward nuclear energy as the solution to our energy needs in the future. This is in spite of the unanswered questions that Bob so well highlighted, as well as information, what we really already do know about the risks associated with radiation and nuclear power. We'd all like to believe the assurances that nuclear power is safe, but unfortunately that just is not true. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time today telling you some things that are important to know about radiation. First of all, there is no safe level of radiation, in spite of how many times we've heard that in the media since the Fukushima crisis. Even radiation that we're exposed to naturally can cause cancer. Besides the naturally occurring radiation, there's another type of radiation that we don't really think about too much that the living world has been burdened with since the dawn of the nuclear age, and that is the radiation that's been released through nuclear weapons use and testing, through all of the whole nuclear fuel cycle, from the uranium mining through the disposal of nuclear waste, and through the releases from nuclear power plants that occur all the time. Not only just the so-called controlled releases that are part of routine procedures, operating procedures, but also through accidents and releases that happen because of human error or neglect of maintenance and safety procedures. So this kind of radiation is often lumped together when you hear about background radiation and levels of radiation that are above background, but it shouldn't be, because we've been exposed to this kind of radiation in a very short period, over just a few decades, whereas we evolved with the kind of natural, true background radiation. So in the wake of the Fukushima disaster, we've heard repeatedly from nuclear industry spokespeople and from government officials that the increases in radiation in the air and water and the food supply are not to worry about, that they're not a hazard to public health. In fact, you may have heard this number of 100 millisieverts thrown around, that less than that is safe. Well, unfortunately, that just isn't true either. The consensus of the medical and scientific community was summarized in the National Research Council's it's called BEERS 3 report, when it stated specifically that 100 millisieverts of radiation exposure confers a 1 in 100 risk of cancer. That may not seem like a lot, a 1% increase risk in cancer when you're thinking about one person, but we're talking about populations here. So if you do the math, if 1 million people are exposed, that means 10,000 of them will get cancer directly as a result. I don't really understand how somebody could call that a safe level. Another important thing to understand about radiation is the difference between internal radiation emitters and external emitters. If the source of radiation is outside yourself, say from a nuclear fuel rod, you can quickly reduce your exposure by moving away. But if the source of radiation is inside you, in your tissues, then it's going to continue to irradiate you as long as it's radioactive. When the radioactive isotopes are released into the atmosphere and the environment, they contaminate things that we can ingest or inhale. And unfortunately, there are a number of biologically active elements that are produced in nuclear power plants. You've heard a lot about iodine-131, which is taken up by the thyroid gland and could cause thyroid cancer. Fortunately, that has a relatively short half-life of 8 days. What that means is that in 5 to 10 half-lives, or 40 to 80 days, the radioactivity will have mostly dissipated. Cesium-137, on the other hand, has a half-life of 30 years. That particular element acts like potassium, so it's disseminated throughout the entire body, where it can cause cancers of a number of different kinds. Strontium-90 has a 29-year half-life, and because that looks like calcium to the body, it's deposited in bones, where it can cause bone cancer and leukemia. And then there's plutonium-239, which is extremely carcinogenic. Even a tiny particle, when it's inhaled and lands in the lung, can cause lung cancer. And I think, as Bob mentioned, plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. So you're not getting rid of that once that particle gets in your lungs. Once released, these elements remain dangerous for centuries, or in the case of plutonium, for literally hundreds of thousands of years. And that adds up to about 12,000 generations when you're thinking about what we're doing to future inhabitants of the Earth. It really puts a whole different perspective on it than thinking about, well, let's see, I guess if my risk of cancer goes up by 1%, that's okay. It's not really what we're talking about here. Another important thing to know when considering the public health risk is that so-called safe levels of radiation are determined based on the effect on what's called the standard adult male, or SAM. And this standard adult male was modeled several decades ago on the average military recruit, who happened to be a man who stood over 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. So despite the obvious size differences, it's well known that women are significantly more susceptible to the adverse effects of radiation than men. Children are much more affected than adults, and fetuses with their rapid growth rate are the most affected of all. A prominent study that came out in 2007 that was performed in Germany was instructive. They looked at communities surrounding 21 different nuclear power plants, and what they found was that for young children under the age of 5, within a 5-kilometer radius, those children had over twice the risk of leukemia than children who lived further away, and a 60% greater risk of all kinds of cancers. More studies like that are needed so that we could begin to understand the risks for just the average people. About a third of Americans live within a 50-mile radius of a nuclear power plant now.